The floods in KZN and the Langa fires have once again put the spotlight on the country's housing crisis. One South Africa movement leader, Mmusi Maimane, recently inked an opinion piece where he details the need for new cities to address urbanization, housing and the poverty crisis. He joins us now to discuss this. Mmusi, thank you so much for joining us this morning. So you're suggesting that, we double the number of South African metros from 8 to 16. You're thinking behind that?
Good morning and good morning to fellow South Africans. No one can deny that the current metros that we've got not only are dysfunctional in many instances, but are incapable of being able to have a proper urbanization plan. So what invariably happens is that you urbanize by urban sprawl through informal settlements, where people come into cities, build shacks, and now you have to play catch up in all cities. What I'm proposing is that ultimately what South Africa needs is a strategic plan that identifies key communities and key areas to build new cities of the future. What that will do is that it will guide the conversation about spatial development. It will address the apartheid spatial legacy that we've got. It will ensure that if you give the appropriate incentives for industry, for housing reallocation, you can have new communities being given face to in South Africa. And ultimately, you don't end up with a scenario upon which the current metro scenarios, particularly the big ones, Joburg, Cape Town, KwaZulu-Natal, have a net in-migration that they fail to be capable of. It's the only way that I see us being able to address the issue over the long term. And ultimately, if we're going to move poor people into the middle class, which is what South Africa's big project ought to be, we must borrow from what China did, which is to be able to build new cities and new industries.
You're talking about building a middle class or a bigger middle class, enhancing the middle class. And when you look at migration, it's almost viewed or associated with many problems. Are you saying maybe it's time to look at it differently, especially internal migration? There could be a positive spin to it.
Completely. This gives a powerful opportunity for South Africa to not only industrialize, but to develop in such a way that it builds infrastructure, it creates new communities. And we can sit back and say, for our freedom, as we look at Freedom Day, these are the number of cities that we've put on the table for new development. So it allows us the space to say migration is going to happen anyways. That's a fact of life. But what this gives us an opportunity today to say is to say, how do we guide that migration and how do we ensure that it's linked to economic and educational outcomes? So to me, I think it's a missed opportunity that South Africa cannot be able to identify these new cities of the future.
Don't we also need to put a bit more focus on rural development?
Part of the cities can be in what historically has been many rural communities. The fact of the matter is, of course, rural development has exacerbated the problem in that if you go to many rural towns, many of them are without water, they're without electricity, which naturally forces citizens to be able to move to urban centers. It also unfortunately limits the economic activity in those, which forces migration. What I'm saying is that given that we have this crisis in rural communities, there's no doubt that our rural community development plan must always be in place. I'm saying for future purposes, building new cities is the way forward. It's the way we move people who are poor into upward mobility of the middle class and new industries to be developed, and also to build in a sustainable manner. When you build a new city, you adopt technology that allows us to be a city of the 21st century rather than building in old ways that we are used to building.
Where do we find the money to do all this?
Well, like any other economic plan, South Africa is spending money, but I would argue the case that it is spending the money in wrong priorities. We keep having a vision for yesterday without focusing on the future. These cities need to be public-private. So let me take another innovative city that is already happening right now, led by businessman Mike Nkuna, that he's building in a community in Limpopo. Here's a new city that will have a new university. It will have, and that is funded by the private sector, but also the public sector needs to come in and allocate the land and build bulk infrastructure, things like bridges, and ensure that actually energy is delivered there. So South Africa doesn't have a money problem, it has a vision problem. Because if money through pension funds and the various financial assets that exist is directed correctly into infrastructure build that is sustainable over a future, we can ensure that we build more cities in order to develop. If we do not do that, we run the risk of not only exacerbating a current unemployment crisis, but making sure that ultimately migration is unmanaged, which means we're waiting for the next flood or the next fire, which will ultimately be a repeated cycle in our country.
You're saying the government tends to be a little bit more reactive than proactive, but in your article you also cite the president admitting, saying, listen, since independence or the dawn of democracy, we haven't built any new cities, but they are planning a smart city. I think it's in Swane, if I'm not correct, but they are looking at it.
Yeah, I think, when I look at this current administration, it's common cause that it hasn't got the capability to be able to deliver against any plan, to be honest with you. It is simply trying to correct the wrongs that it created. So how do you then convince anybody that you need enough financial capital through capital markets and government bonds that you are going to build new cities if you can't administer the current ones? It also suffers from high levels of corruption, so trust levels are low. So to me, I think that when I listen to government planning, it's clear that it is not able to even maintain the current cities that it has. I'm saying we build a new administration that is able to focus simply on this one particular project. And that way we can move. We can have cities that are built and an administration that is able to work in those cities. I would argue the fact that we need to focus on a vision for the future rather than reacting to yesterday's problems.
You think we sometimes ignore the fact that you need the numbers for your economy to grow? If I'm to produce more packets of sweets, I need more people to buy them. I mean, it's pretty basic to a certain extent, isn't it?
Of course, and that's a very important issue as it speaks to the continent of Africa. We've got 1.2 billion people coming into the continent by 2040. So it would be illogical for South Africa to suggest that its own GDP growth will depend only on its own size of the population. It needs to be able to maximize its ability to trade with the rest of Africa so that we can increase not only the number of consumers, but the new economies that we can work with. So that's why I've maintained that this discussion about saying the problems of South Africa about immigrants is misguided. Actually, what we need to look at the immigration discussion equally so is to say, how do we integrate better and trade with our fellow African counterparts, ensure there's thorough registration of people, adjudication of visas, so that we can broaden the market pool. It's a great opportunity not only for South African companies to be able to broaden into the continent, but it allows for us to learn from technologies in other countries, such as Kenya with M-Pesa, but also it means that we can maximize the diversity of energy by a combination of gas and oil that is available in other SADC countries, that we can be able to stabilize the grid here in South Africa. We've got to think as the future leading economy rather than an economy that is industrializing on yesterday's technology.
Mmusi Maimane, thank you so much for speaking with us here on NewsLink. One South Africa movement leader saying we need to build more metros as we're looking at internal migration. It's never going to end.